When Elon Musk walked into Pastor Stephen Furtick's church unannounced, no one knew why, and neither did he. But what started as silent curiosity quickly turned into a life-altering dialogue about purpose, faith, and the limits of success. What happened next shocked everyone, and it might change how you see both men forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was a typical Sunday morning at Elevation Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. The worship team played with energy, lights pulsed with rhythm, and the large auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Pastor Stephen Furtick walked confidently onto the stage, welcomed the congregation, and began his sermon without delay. The crowd was engaged, clapping, cheering, and nodding along with every powerful point he made. In that moment, no one was paying attention to the doors quietly opening in the back of the room. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, Elon Musk entered almost unnoticed. He walked slowly, eyes scanning the room, and found an empty seat along the back row. There were no bodyguards, no entourage, no publicists. Just one of the most famous men in the world, slipping into the shadows of a sanctuary built for faith, not fame. A few nearby congregants glanced in his direction, their eyes widening in surprise. Whispers began to spread like a ripple across still water. Phones were raised briefly, quickly lowered, but something in Elon's posture, stilled, respectful, thoughtful, kept anyone from approaching. On stage, Pastor Furtick caught the stir in the crowd. He squinted toward the back, registered the presence of his unexpected guest, and smiled briefly. But he didn't miss a beat. He continued with his message. Today's theme: finding purpose beyond success. The word struck differently that morning, and Elon Musk, usually restless and analytical, sat quietly. No notes, no phone, just listening. Something in him was starting to move. As the final notes of worship faded and the congregation slowly filed out, Elon Musk did something no one expected. He stayed. While most guests of his status would have exited quickly, slipping back into the world of headlines and high-tech labs, Elon remained seated, his gaze fixed forward, deep in thought. Only when the sanctuary was nearly empty did he rise and walk slowly toward the front of the stage, where Pastor Stephen Furtick was still greeting members of his church. Their eyes met briefly, two men from vastly different worlds. Elon extended his hand. Stephen took it with a steady smile, both sensing the weight of the moment. It wasn't the usual celebrity photo op. There was something more personal beneath it. "I'd like to talk more," Elon said simply. "You said some things today that I've been wrestling with." Stephen nodded without hesitation. "I'd love that. Want to meet for coffee tomorrow morning?" "Perfect," Elon replied, already pulling out his phone to lock it in. Neither man knew that this conversation, two minds intersecting over meaning, purpose, and the space between science and faith, would soon ignite something far bigger than themselves. It would become a spark that millions would see, and many more would never forget. The next morning, in a quiet corner of a local cafe, Elon Musk sat across from Pastor Stephen Furtick. The air was still. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and their table was tucked away from curious eyes. Elon leaned back in his chair, holding his cup thoughtfully, the steam curling in front of him. "I've been thinking a lot about influence," Elon began, "and legacy. What it means when millions of people hang on your words, follow your lead, expect you to deliver something." He looked around the cafe, then added, "At your church yesterday, I noticed something I rarely see in my world. People seemed real, present, not chasing status or trying to impress." Furtick nodded but said nothing yet. Elon continued, "You've built a community that actually believes in something. That's rare, especially when that something is, well, ancient texts, invisible forces." He gave a small chuckle. "You're clearly intelligent. You know psychology, leadership, Why build everything around stories from 2,000 years ago? Stephen leaned forward. Because those stories still change lives. Elon looked at him, his expression serious. I believe in logic, in facts. I build what I can measure. But lately, it feels like something's missing. Like I've answered all the how questions, but not the why. There was a pause. Then Stephen spoke, quietly but clearly. What if truth isn't limited to what can be measured? Elon didn't answer. He didn't scoff. He just sat there, stirring his coffee slowly, eyes distant, contemplating a question he'd never seriously considered before. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't being asked to defend an idea, but to explore one he couldn't quite explain. Something inside him had shifted, and he knew, somehow, that the conversation was only just beginning. Elon leaned forward in his seat, fingers interlaced around the warm ceramic mug. Let's be honest, he said. You talk about belief, faith, the divine, but there's no real evidence, not the kind that holds up in a lab. Faith might feel comforting, but it's not measurable. Stephen nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. What kind of evidence would be enough, he asked, if God exists, truly exists, beyond time, beyond matter, beyond dimensions, then what tool in your scientific toolbox could possibly capture that? Elon shrugged. I don't know. But we prove things with repeatable results, observations, experiments. If something's real, it should show up in the data. Stephen smiled gently. But we live by things every day that aren't measurable. Love, morality, conscience. You can't run a test to prove someone's love is real, but you'd know if it was missing. Elon didn't argue with that. Instead, he shifted topics slightly. I do admire Jesus, you know. As a moral figure, love your enemy, turn the other cheek, serve the poor, those are revolutionary ideas, even genius. But I don't buy the supernatural side, the miracles, the resurrection. It's myth layered on top of message. Stephen leaned back, crossing his arms with curiosity. That's where it gets interesting, because Jesus didn't really leave the option open to be just a teacher. He made claims about himself, claims that were radical. He claimed to forgive sins. He called himself the Son of God. Elon raised an eyebrow. You're referring to the trilemma argument? Exactly, Stephen said. If someone says the things Jesus said, they're either a liar, a lunatic, or they're telling the truth. But a merely good teacher? That option disappears when you really listen to him. Elon considered that. It's a clever argument, but I don't think it's airtight. Maybe some of the claims were added later. Maybe people misunderstood him. History is full of figures whose words were distorted by followers. Stephen didn't push. That's fair, he said. But even so, the weight of what Jesus taught and the willingness of his closest friends to die defending those claims makes me pause. People don't willingly suffer for what they know is a lie. Elon nodded slowly, unless they really believed it was true. Exactly, Stephen agreed. Which means we have to at least consider what they believed so strongly and why. The cafe had grown quiet around them, the buzz of morning customers fading into background noise. Elon stared into his coffee, the earlier skepticism still present, but now tangled with something else. Not agreement, not yet, but curiosity. You're challenging my categories, he admitted. I'm used to having answers, or at least asking questions that science can one day answer. This is different. Stephen offered a warm smile. It is different. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask deeper ones. For a long moment, neither man spoke. There was no winning or losing, just two minds pushing and pulling at the edges of understanding. Something in Elon's expression softened. Not submission, but a kind of openness that hadn't been there before. I still disagree, Elon said quietly, but I'm listening. Stephen nodded, meeting his gaze with a quiet steadiness. That's all I ever ask. And for the first time, It felt like they weren't debating anymore. They were exploring. The Furtick home was warm and inviting, far simpler than Elon expected. It didn't reflect the public image of a man who led one of the most dynamic churches in the country. It felt normal. A modest house in a regular neighborhood. A dinner table set for 6. No fanfare, no cameras, no show. Holly Furtick greeted Elon with a cheerful welcome and led him inside. The kids, polite but unfazed, shook his hand and asked what he liked more, rockets or electric cars. Elon smiled genuinely, surprised by the ease of the moment. Dinner was filled with laughter, easy conversation, and stories that had nothing to do with religion or science. It was family in its purest form, real, grounded. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the kids had gone off to bed, Stephen invited Elon into his study. Books lined the walls, a simple desk, 2 chairs, no pulpit, no production, just a space for honest conversation. "You know," Stephen said as he poured 2 glasses of water, "I think this is the part of faith that's hardest for people to see. The ordinary, the lived-in parts." Elon nodded. "Dinner tonight. It wasn't what I expected. I thought maybe it'd feel staged, but it didn't. It felt real." Stephen smiled, sitting down across from him. "That's because it is." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Elon leaned forward. "Let's go back to the big stuff," he said. "Miracles, resurrection, parting seas. It all sounds impossible." Stephen met his gaze. "You build rockets that land themselves. You're working on brain-computer interfaces. To someone 100 years ago, your entire life would sound impossible." "Doesn't mean it's not real." "That's different," Elon countered. "I use science, math, physics." Stephen shrugged gently. "And who gave us that science? Who set those laws in place? You say miracles defy explanation, but maybe they just defy our current understanding." Elon looked thoughtful. "You're saying faith doesn't abandon reason, it expands it." "I'm saying," Stephen replied, "maybe faith is a lens, not a crutch. Maybe it's what helps us see the full picture, not just the part that's measurable." Elon glanced around the room, taking in the quiet simplicity of it. "When I was a kid, I asked questions like, what happens after we die? Or why does anything exist at all? But no one really answered, so I turned to what I could measure, what I could build." "And you built a lot," Stephen said with respect. "But even when I succeeded," Elon continued, "there was always this strange emptiness, like I had touched the stars, but still didn't understand the ground beneath me." Stephen nodded slowly. "Because you were made to ask those deeper questions, and maybe those answers don't come in data sets, maybe they come in stories, relationships, experiences." Elon stared into his glass, quiet. "What if I want to believe, but I can't?" "Then you're already closer than you think," Stephen said. "Because belief doesn't start with certainty. It starts with curiosity and courage." There was a long pause between them. Finally, Elon whispered, "I don't know if I'm there yet." Stephen smiled gently. "That's okay. You're here, and that's something." The study went quiet again, but this time it was a good quiet, not empty, not unresolved, just still. A seed planted, questions unfolding. Elon stood to leave. As he shook Stephen's hand, he didn't have answers, but he had a feeling he wasn't finished asking. The next morning, Elon arrived at Elevation Church's main office just before 10 a.m., still unsure why he had said yes. Stephen had texted him late the night before, inviting him to visit one of their community outreach centers. "Come see faith in action," he'd written. It piqued Elon's curiosity, more than he wanted to admit. When he pulled up, Stephen was already waiting, casually dressed and smiling as he opened the passenger door of a modest church van. "Ready?" he asked. They drove through parts of Charlotte that Elon had never seen. It wasn't the polished city skyline or suburban neighborhoods. This was the struggling side of town. Worn buildings, shuttered businesses, people lining up outside a nondescript warehouse. But inside that warehouse, Elon found something he didn't expect. There were no sermons playing, no crosses on the walls, just stations of activity: a food bank, a clothing closet, a health clinic, job training programs. Volunteers moved quietly and efficiently, offering help with a kindness that wasn't performative. No one looked for attention. No one asked for credit. Stephen led Elon through the space, introducing him to people along the way. "This is Monica," he said at one point, gesturing to a young woman overseeing a group of teens gathered around outdated laptops. "She runs our coding program." Monica smiled, clearly surprised but composed. "We teach programming to middle and high school students, some adults too. We focus on communities that don't usually have access to this kind of tech education." Elon stepped closer, glancing at the equipment. "You're doing this with these machines?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Barely," Monica laughed. "We make it work." Elon hesitated. Then, without thinking too hard, he said, "I think I can help. I've got some hardware we could donate, and maybe a few curriculum ideas if you're open to it." Monica's face lit up. That would be incredible. As they continued the tour, Elon remained quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from disinterest. It was the silence of someone watching, absorbing, feeling something shift. These people weren't earning profits. They weren't building brands. They were building lives. Quietly, intentionally, with compassion. When they returned to the church, Stephen asked gently, "What are you thinking?" Elon took a moment. "This isn't what I expected. The people here, they're not driven by attention. They're driven by something deeper, purpose. I spend most of my life around people who want something from me, but these folks, they just want to give." Stephen nodded. "That's what love looks like in action." That evening, Elon didn't return to his usual routine. Instead of reviewing reports or sketching designs, he walked into his study and opened the small book Stephen had given him days earlier, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. The words were dense but engaging, and something about Lewis's logical, honest tone struck a chord. Page after page, Elon found his skepticism acknowledged, even mirrored. The doubts he'd buried, the ones science had never answered, were laid bare. Lewis wasn't preaching, he was reasoning, wrestling, searching. When he closed the book for the night, Elon didn't feel converted. But he did feel cracked open. He sat by the window in silence, the city lights glowing beyond the glass. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the pressure to solve something. He felt called. Not to build another company or launch another product, but to serve, to seek, to listen. And without fully understanding why, he whispered quietly, "Maybe there's more." 2 weeks later, Elon Musk did something unexpected. He posted a tweet. Not about rockets, not about artificial intelligence, not even about business. It was simple, but it lit up the internet within seconds. Been having fascinating conversations with @Stephen Furtick about faith, reason, and legacy. Still skeptical, but asking better questions now. Within an hour, the post had gone viral. Major outlets picked it up instantly. Rumors swirled. Was Elon converting to Christianity? Had he become religious? What exactly did asking better questions mean? Commentators on both sides rushed to interpret it. Atheist circles expressed confusion or dismay. Christian influencers celebrated prematurely. And Elon, observing the storm, sat back with a kind of amused detachment, until it became clear that silence would only fuel more speculation. Stephen called him that evening. "You okay with all this noise?" Elon chuckled lightly. "I expected a ripple, not a tidal wave." They agreed that it was time to talk about it, openly, honestly, and without any scripted answers. Stephen proposed something bold, a live-streamed public conversation from Elevation Church. No filters, no rehearsed talking points, just two people with different worldviews having a civil dialogue. "No edits," Elon insisted. "None," Stephen confirmed. Let's show people how disagreement can still look like respect. The announcement went out the next day. Within minutes, seats for the in-person event sold out. The live stream link trended across platforms. Media outlets lined up to cover it. Everyone wanted to know what Elon Musk and a mega-church pastor would say when seated face-to-face on a stage with no teleprompter in sight. The night arrived. The auditorium at Elevation Church was packed. Cameras surrounded the simple stage, which featured just 2 chairs and 2 microphones. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, not because they expected a debate, but because they sensed something rare was about to happen, a real conversation. Stephen opened with gratitude. Tonight isn't about winning or convincing. It's about honoring curiosity, humility, and truth. Then he turned to Elon, who sat calmly but attentively. "Why did you agree to this?" Elon thought for a moment. "Because I've had my assumptions challenged, in a good way. I didn't grow up with faith. My world has always been about what can be tested, built, scaled. But in the last few weeks, I've seen people live out something that doesn't make sense from a purely scientific perspective. That kind of love, that kind of service." It made me pause. Stephen nodded, but didn't interrupt. "Faith," Elon continued, "isn't my language. I still have serious questions about God, about Jesus, about the supernatural, but I respect what I've seen. Not in books, in people." The audience sat in complete silence. Even online, viewers commented about how different this felt. Unscripted, raw, and sincere. Stephen leaned forward. "You've said before that you admired Jesus as a teacher. After all this, do you see him any differently?" Elon didn't answer immediately. "I still see a man who taught radical love, humility, and sacrifice. Whether he was divine? That's the question I'm still turning over. But I will say this. I'm no longer dismissing it out of hand. It wasn't a conversion moment. It wasn't a confession. It was something more powerful, honesty. And for everyone watching, whether in the crowd or behind a screen, it felt like a new kind of conversation had just begun." The public conversation between Elon Musk and Pastor Stephen Furtick didn't end when the live stream went offline. It sparked something far greater than either of them had anticipated. Across the country, and even around the world, people began having real, civil conversations about faith and reason. The polarized silence that had existed between science and belief cracked open just enough to let something new in. Dialogue. News outlets ran headlines for days. Podcasts debated the implications. Social media was flooded with posts, reactions, and think pieces from all perspectives. And while not everyone agreed with what was said, most agreed on one thing. It had been respectful, thought-provoking, and long overdue. But for Elon, it wasn't just about conversation anymore. Within weeks, he made a bold announcement. Through a partnership between his tech companies and Elevation Church, he would help establish a new initiative, 10 technology and coding education centers in underserved communities across the United States. Elevation would provide the facilities and local community infrastructure. Elon's team would supply equipment, instructors, and curriculum design. Reporters immediately asked the obvious, why partner with a church? Elon didn't dodge the question. Because they're doing the work, he said plainly. They have trust where we don't. I care about impact. I care about results. This makes sense. The criticism came fast. Some corporate investors were uneasy about associating with a faith-based institution. Meanwhile, some religious leaders questioned Elon's spiritual sincerity, but he stayed grounded, unmoved by the noise. When asked in a press interview how he felt about the backlash, Elon answered simply, "That's how I know it matters. If both sides are uncomfortable, we're probably moving in the right direction." Months passed. Planning turned into building, building turned into training, training turned into invitations, and finally, the opening day arrived. The first center, A sleek, state-of-the-art learning hub built inside a repurposed warehouse in one of Charlotte's toughest neighborhoods was ready. Local families gathered with their children, volunteers and instructors stood side by side. A crowd began to form outside the entrance as reporters arrived. Inside, Elon and Stephen stood together behind a bright red ribbon stretched across the front doors. They weren't dressed up, no suits. Just two men in simple shirts and jeans, one a tech visionary, the other a pastor. Different lives, different beliefs, but the same purpose. Stephen held the scissors first, but motioned for Elon to take them. Elon hesitated, then smiled. "Let's do it together." They held the scissors side by side and cut the ribbon. The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, and for a brief moment, the world seemed a little more connected. Inside the center, kids began exploring the computers. Instructors answered questions, parents watched with pride. It wasn't just a building, it was a future, being rewritten, line by line, student. Later that afternoon, Elon addressed the group gathered inside. He didn't give a corporate presentation. He didn't talk about Mars or batteries or neural links. Instead, he looked around at the faces of children, volunteers, teachers, and parents. "Sometimes the most powerful innovations," he said, "don't come from new technology. They come from unity, from people who believe in something greater than themselves, whether that's faith, purpose, or simply the next generation." He paused. "This started as a conversation, but now it's a collaboration, and I think that's where real change begins." The room was quiet for a second. Then someone started clapping. Soon everyone was on their feet, not for Elon, not for Stephen, but for what they had created together. And in that moment, it was clear. The real legacy wasn't a center or a sermon. It was a bridge built between two worlds that had stopped talking. Until now. Before the ribbon was cut, before the cameras turned on, Elon Musk sat quietly in one of the classrooms. Rows of brand new computers lined the walls, waiting for students who hadn't yet arrived. The room was silent, but full of promise. He stared at the empty chairs, then looked up as Stephen Furtick entered. "This wasn't the plan," Elon said quietly, his voice low but sure. "But maybe it was the purpose." Stephen smiled, standing beside him. Elon turned, looked him in the eyes, and added, "Let's build something that outlives both of us." That moment wasn't broadcast or posted, but for them it mattered more than any headline. If this inspiring story moved you, if it opened your heart to new possibilities, subscribe for more powerful stories of faith, dialogue, and discovery. Because sometimes, the most meaningful journeys begin in the moments no one planned, and they change everything.